If you sign that, you lose everything. The words landed just as Daniel Whitmore's pen hovered over a $100 million contract, the skyline of Manhattan glowing behind glass walls while a dozen executives leaned forward, waiting for the moment ink would turn into power. But instead, time stalled. His hand froze midair, and slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the voice that didn't belong, a black waitress standing beside the projection screen. Tray still in her hand, posture steady, eyes locked on numbers no one else had questioned. The room shifted, not loudly, but enough, a ripple under polished silence. Daniel's jaw tightened, the kind of tension built from years of control, of winning rooms like this without resistance. "You're out of line," he said, low, precise, a warning more than a statement. But she didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't shrink. Because Naomi Carter had spent too many nights being invisible to mistake this moment for anything small. She had seen the spreadsheet flicker earlier, just for a second, a decimal buried in projections, a growth curve that bent too perfectly. And something in her mind, trained not by boardrooms, but by survival, by watching patterns, by studying numbers long after her shifts ended, refused to let it go. "Your model's off," she said quietly, her voice not loud enough to challenge the room, but sharp enough to cut through it. One of the analysts scoffed under his breath. Another glanced at Daniel, waiting for him to shut it down. But curiosity, dangerous and rare, held him still. "Explain," he said, the words slipping out before authority could catch it. Naomi stepped closer to the screen, setting the tray down without breaking eye contact, her finger tracing a line of projections. "Right there," she said. "You're compounding a 12% growth rate on a base that already includes projected expansion. You double counting the upside." The room didn't react at first, not because they disagreed, but because they understood. Slowly, screens lit up. Fingers moved. Whispers replaced confidence. And in the reflection of the glass wall, Daniel saw it happen, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, certainty. Cracking, the deal unraveling in real time. Millions shifting, risk expanding, and the quietest person in the room becoming the most important one. He looked back at her, really looked this time, not at the uniform, not at the role, but at the precision behind her words. And for the first time that night, the man who owned the room wasn't sure he understood it anymore. Because the question wasn't whether she was right. The numbers were already answering that. The real question was far more unsettling. How did she see what none of them could? Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than any command he had ever given as the analysts around the table leaned closer to their screens, fingers moving faster now, recalculating, verifying, questioning assumptions they had approved just minutes earlier, while the polished confidence that filled the room began to thin, replaced by something colder, something uncertain. And Naomi stood there without moving, not claiming victory, not explaining further, just waiting. Because she knew the numbers would speak louder than she ever could. One of the senior analysts cleared his throat, his voice tighter than before. "She is correct," he said, barely above a whisper. And that was enough. The kind of statement that does not need volume to change everything. Daniel's eyes flicked back to the projection, then to the contract, then back to Naomi. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar in a room he controlled. Hesitation, not because he doubted himself, but because the foundation he trusted had just shifted beneath him. "Run the downside scenario," he ordered, his voice steady again, but sharper now, more focused, and the screens adjusted, numbers cascading, projections bending in a direction no one had planned for, millions shaved off valuations, risk expanding like a crack in glass. And the deal that had looked flawless moments ago now revealed its edges, its weaknesses, its cost, the kind of cost that does not just affect numbers, but reputations, decisions, legacies. The room grew quieter with every recalculation. No more side conversations, no more confident nods, just the low hum of systems and the quiet realization that they had been seconds away from signing something they did not fully understand. Daniel exhaled slowly, controlled, measured, the way a man does when he refuses to let the room see the shift inside him. Then he looked at Naomi again, not as staff, not as background, but as the variable no one accounted for. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, not accusing, not dismissing, but searching, Because people like her were not supposed to exist in rooms like this, not in this way, not with this kind of precision. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, grounded. "I pay attention," she said, and it sounded simple, almost too simple for the impact it carried. But behind those words were years of watching, learning, absorbing what others ignored. Daniel studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to signal a shift the entire room could feel, because power had just recalibrated, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And as the analysts continued to adjust projections, uncovering deeper inconsistencies hidden beneath the surface, one realization began to settle in. This was not just a mistake, it was a pattern, and patterns like this did not happen by accident. The numbers did not just shift, they unraveled, line after line, exposing something deeper than a simple oversight. And the more the analysts dug, the more the room leaned into a truth no one wanted to say out loud. One of them finally did, his voice lower now, cautious. "This is structured to look stable, but it collapses under pressure." And that word, structured, hung in the air like a warning, because mistakes happen, but patterns are designed. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he stepped closer to the screen, no longer sitting at the head of the table, but standing among the data, studying it from a different angle, the way he had in the early days before titles and power had placed distance between him and the details. "Show me the original inputs," he said, and the data shifted again, revealing the source layers, the assumptions that fed the model, the place where truth either begins or gets rewritten. Naomi watched quietly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes moved with the numbers, anticipating where they would land before they did, because she had seen this kind of structure before, not in billion-dollar boardrooms, but in smaller, quieter places where errors were not accidents but opportunities. One of the junior analysts hesitated before speaking. These inputs were provided directly by the partner firm. And that was it, the missing piece sliding into place, the kind that does not explode but settles heavily, because now the risk had a direction. Daniel straightened slightly, his posture sharpening as control returned, not the blind control of confidence, but the precise control of awareness. "So the projections are inflated," he said, more to himself than anyone else, and the analyst nodded. "Yes, and consistently so across multiple scenarios." Another screen lit up, highlighting the discrepancies, small individually, almost invisible, but together forming a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The room was no longer just cautious, it was alert, every person recalibrating their role, their assumptions, their understanding of what this deal actually was. Daniel turned back to Naomi, his gaze steady, measuring. "You saw this from a glance," he said, not as disbelief, but as confirmation, and she gave a small nod, not proud, not hesitant, just honest. "It did not match," she replied. Simple, direct, and somehow more powerful than any technical explanation, because truth often is. Daniel let out a quiet breath, then reached for the contract again. But this time he did not sign. Instead he closed it, the sound soft but final, and in that moment, the entire room understood what had just been avoided, not just a bad investment, but a carefully hidden failure. And as the executives began speaking again, this time with urgency instead of certainty, one realization settled deeper than the numbers themselves. Naomi had not just corrected a formula, she had revealed intent, and intent changes everything. The room did not return to normal. It recalibrated, voices lower now, sharper, every word measured against the weight of what had just been uncovered while Daniel stood still for a moment longer, not as the man who almost signed, but as the man who stopped himself just in time, and that difference mattered. He turned slightly toward his team. "Pull every document this partner has sent in the last 90 days, he said, calm but decisive. And immediately the energy shifted from reaction to investigation, screens split, files opened, timelines reconstructed. And Naomi stepped back just enough to return to the edge of the room, not disappearing, but no longer standing at the center, because she understood something most people in that room did not. Attention is temporary, but truth stays. One of the executives, a man who had not spoken until now, leaned forward with a tighter expression. "If this is intentional, it is not just a bad deal, it is exposure." And that word landed differently. Not financial, but reputational. The kind of damage that spreads quietly and lasts longer than any number on a spreadsheet. Daniel nodded once, already. Ahead of it. We verify everything before this goes any further, he said, then paused, his eyes shifting back to Naomi again, not out of curiosity this time, but recognition, because in a room full of specialists, analysts, and advisors, the person who changed the outcome was the one who was never meant to speak. You noticed a pattern, he said, more statement than question, and Naomi met his gaze, her voice steady. It was too consistent, she replied. Real growth has noise. This was clean. Too clean. A few heads turned at that, not because they disagreed, but because they had missed it, and missing something that obvious, once seen, is the kind of realization that lingers. Daniel gave a slight nod, almost to himself, because he understood now. She was not reacting to a single error, she was recognizing behavior, and behavior reveals intent faster than numbers do. The analysts began confirming it, one by one, scenario after scenario showing the same pattern, the same inflation, the same precision designed to avoid suspicion while maximizing appeal, and the deal that once looked like an opportunity now looked like a test, one they had nearly failed. Daniel walked back to the head of the table, but he did not sit. He placed both hands lightly on the surface, grounding himself in the decision he had just made. We are not proceeding, he said, clear and final, and no one argued. Because the room had already reached that conclusion. They were just waiting for him to say it. A contract worth $100 million closed not with a signature, but with understanding, and as the team moved into action, contacting legal, preparing responses, shifting strategy, Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, his attention returning to Naomi, not as an interruption, not as a surprise, but as something far more rare, an answer to a question he had not known he needed to ask. Because in a world built on projections, forecasts, and controlled outcomes, she had done something none of them could manufacture. She saw the truth before it was too late. The room moved fast now, but Daniel Whitmore slowed down, because speed fixes problems, but clarity prevents them. And he was no longer interested in reacting, he was interested in understanding. Trace the origin of every adjusted input, he said, his voice controlled, deliberate. And the analysts followed without hesitation, building a chain backward through layers of data, timestamps, revisions, each step revealing how carefully the illusion had been constructed, while Naomi remained near the edge of the room, hands still, posture quiet, as if nothing about this moment belonged to her. Yet everything had started because of her. One of the senior advisors looked up from his screen, concern tightening his expression. These revisions were spaced out over weeks, small enough to avoid detection, but consistent enough to shift valuation. And that was the second confirmation, not an error, not an accident, but a strategy. Daniel nodded once, absorbing it, then glanced again toward Naomi, not to question her, but to align what he now knew with what she had already seen. You recognized the pattern immediately, he said, and this time there was no skepticism in his tone, only precision. Naomi hesitated for the briefest moment, not out of doubt, but because explaining instinct is never simple. It was too perfect, she said finally, her voice steady. Real data breathes, it moves, it has friction. This did not. A quiet shift moved through the room as those words settled, because they did not just describe the problem, they exposed the mindset behind it. Daniel's expression changed slightly, not softer, but deeper, as if recalculating something beyond the numbers. What is your background? He asked, and for the first time, the question carried weight beyond curiosity. Naomi looked at him, then at the screens, then back again. I studied accounting for 2 years, she said, but I had to stop. She did not explain further. She did not need to, because some stories are understood without detail, especially in rooms where success is often mistaken for simplicity. Daniel nodded slowly, processing not just her answer, but what it represented: potential interrupted, talent overlooked, insight existing outside the systems designed to measure it. One of the executives shifted in his seat, glancing between Naomi and the data, as if trying to reconcile the two, and that tension between expectation and reality filled the room more than any numbers could. Daniel stepped away from the table, closing the distance between himself and Naomi, not as a gesture of power, but of acknowledgement. "You saved us from a significant loss," he said, direct, unembellished, because anything more would have been unnecessary. Naomi gave a small nod, not accepting praise, not rejecting it, simply letting it pass, because she had not spoken for recognition. She had spoken because it was right, and Daniel understood that, perhaps more clearly than anything else that had happened that day, because in a room built on incentives, projections, and outcomes, she had acted without any of them. And that made her different. The analyst continued working, confirming deeper layers of inconsistency, building a case that would not just stop the deal, but expose it. And as the reality of what had been avoided settled into something more solid, more permanent, Daniel realized something else, something quieter, but just as important. The most valuable insight in the room had not come from experience, or authority, or position. It had come from attention, and attention, when paired with courage, changes everything. The momentum in the room did not fade. It sharpened, like a lens finally brought into focus, and Daniel Whitmore understood that what they were uncovering was no longer just about a single deal. It was about a system that had been trusted without question. "I want a full audit of every partnership tied to this firm," he said, his voice steady but carrying a new edge, not urgency, but precision, the kind that comes when instinct and evidence align. And immediately the room responded, not with hesitation, but with clarity, because now they knew what they were looking for, patterns, not promises. Naomi remained where she was, no longer the center, but no longer invisible either, and that shift lingered in the air, subtle but undeniable. One of the analysts spoke again, this time more certain. "There are similar structures in at least 3 prior proposals," and that confirmation landed deeper than the first, because it extended beyond today, beyond this room, into decisions already made, deals already signed. Daniel's expression did not change, but his silence did. It became heavier, more deliberate, as he absorbed the scale of it, not just what had been avoided, but what might have already passed unnoticed. "Flag them all," he said quietly, and the team moved faster, pulling historical data, cross-referencing timelines, rebuilding narratives that once seemed complete. And Naomi watched it unfold with a calm that did not come from detachment, but from recognition, because this was how truth worked, not loud, not immediate, but persistent, revealing itself layer by layer until it could no longer be ignored. Daniel turned toward her again, not out of curiosity this time, but something closer to respect. "You saw this before we did," he said, and the statement carried weight, not as praise, but as acknowledgement of a gap that should not have existed. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unchanged. "You were looking at outcomes," she said. "I was looking at behavior." And that distinction settled into the room like a final piece of understanding, because outcomes can be shaped, but behavior leaves traces, and those traces had been there all along. Daniel gave a slight nod, the kind that signals not agreement, but alignment, then looked back at the screens, now filled with evidence instead of projections, and for a moment, he allowed himself to see the difference between control and awareness, between assumption and observation, between power and perception. The executives around him were no longer reacting. They were recalibrating, adjusting strategies, preparing responses, shifting positions with a level of caution that had not existed an hour earlier. And at the edge of it all stood Naomi Carter, not elevated, not transformed, but recognized, which in that room was more powerful than either, because recognition changes how people listen, and Daniel was listening now, not just to the data, not just to his team, but to the one voice that had cut through everything else, the one that did not belong by title, but belonged by truth. And as the investigation deepened, one realization settled in quietly, almost unnoticed. The most dangerous mistakes are not the ones you make, but the ones you never see. And today, someone who was never meant to be seen had made all the difference. By the time the last set of data finished loading, the room no longer felt like a place where deals were made. It felt like a place where decisions were questioned, and Daniel Whitmore stood at the center of it with a clarity he had not carried into the room that morning. Not because he had lost control, but because he had seen what control without awareness looks like: fragile, incomplete, dangerous. One of the legal advisors spoke carefully, choosing each word with intention. If this extends to prior agreements, we may need to reassess exposure across multiple quarters. And that shifted the scale again. Not just a single moment avoided, but a timeline that might need to be rewritten. Daniel nodded slowly, already calculating the ripple effect, not just financially, but strategically, because trust once broken does not repair itself. It must be rebuilt, and rebuilt differently. Start the review immediately, he said, then paused, his attention drifting back toward Naomi, who had not moved much, who had not inserted herself again, who had not tried to explain or expand beyond what was necessary. And that restraint, that precision, stood out more than anything else in a room full of people trained to speak, to present, to justify. Daniel stepped closer, closing the distance once more, but this time there was no tension, no challenge, only intent. You said you studied accounting, he began, his voice quieter now, less performative, more direct. Why did you stop? And Naomi held his gaze for a moment before answering. Not defensive, not emotional, just honest. Life required something else, she said, and that was enough. Because in those words lived a reality that numbers do not capture, priorities that models do not predict, choices that do not show up on balance sheets. Daniel absorbed that, not as information, but as context, and context changes how decisions are made, how people are seen, how value is understood. He nodded once, then glanced back at the screens, where the team was still uncovering layers, still connecting patterns, still confirming what had already become clear. This was not just about intelligence. It was about perspective, and perspective is shaped by experience, not position. One of the analysts spoke up again, more confidently now. We are finding consistent inflation in at least 5 separate projections tied to this firm. And that sealed it. Not just a flawed deal, but a flawed relationship. Daniel straightened slightly, the weight of the decision settling into something firm, something final. Then we disengage completely, he said, and the words did not echo, they anchored, because everyone in the room understood what they meant. Not just a contract withdrawn, but a direction changed, a standard reset. And as the team moved to execute, to communicate, to protect what had almost been compromised, Daniel remained still for a moment longer, his attention returning once more to Naomi Carter, not as an anomaly, not as an interruption, but as a constant he had not accounted for. And in that realization, something shifted quietly but permanently, because the most valuable voice in the room had not been the loudest, or the most experienced, or the most expected. It had been the one that saw clearly when everyone else assumed. And Daniel knew, without needing to say it out loud, that this would not be the last time he listened to her. The room began to settle, not into comfort, but into a new kind of awareness, one where every assumption was now questioned before it was accepted, and Daniel Whitmore stood at the head of the table once again. But this time the position meant something different. It was no longer about leading a decision. It was about earning it. Prepare a statement, he said to his legal team. We are suspending all negotiations effective immediately. And there was no hesitation, no debate, because the evidence had already spoken louder than any argument could. Across the room, screens dimmed slightly as files were saved, reports compiled, and what had once been a moment of momentum turned into a moment of recalibration. Naomi Carter reached for her tray again, her movements quiet, almost routine, as if she were stepping back into a role that no longer fit the same way it had before. And for a second, it seemed like the room might allow that, might let her fade back into the background. But Daniel did not look away this time. Naomi, he said, her name cutting gently through the noise, and the room paused again, not with tension, but with attention. She stopped, turning slightly, her posture still composed, still grounded. Yes, she answered, simple, direct. Daniel walked toward her, not quickly, not slowly, but with intention, every step measured, not to assert control, but to acknowledge it had shifted. You said you studied accounting, he continued. Do you still work with numbers? And Naomi held his gaze, not intimidated, not elevated, just present. Every day, she replied. Just not where anyone looks. And a few quiet glances passed between the executives, because that answer carried more weight than a resume ever could. Daniel nodded, understanding more than the words themselves, understanding what it meant to develop skill without recognition, to see patterns without permission, to hold knowledge without a platform. He paused for a moment, then made a decision that did not require a contract. "I want you to come back tomorrow," he said, not as staff, but as part of the team. And the words did not echo, but they shifted something deeper, not just for Naomi, but for everyone in the room who had just watched value redefine itself in real time. Naomi did not react immediately, not out of disbelief, but out of clarity, because offers like that are not just opportunities, they are changes, and change requires understanding. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, not skeptical, just precise. Daniel met her question without hesitation. "Because you saw what we did not," he said, "and I do not build teams that ignore that." The room held that moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, and honesty in rooms like this is rare. Naomi considered it for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not accepting everything, but accepting the possibility, and as she picked up her tray again, not as a symbol of where she stood, but of where she had started, one truth became clear to everyone watching. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it speaks quietly, corrects a single line, and changes everything that follows. The room did not return to what it was, because moments like that do not reset, they redefine. And as the last of the executives filed out, carrying laptops, documents, and a quieter kind of thinking, the skyline outside had shifted from sharp daylight to a softer glow, the kind that reflects rather than reveals, and Daniel Whitmore remained by the window for a moment, looking out not at the city, but at the reflection in the glass, a room that had nearly made a decision it did not understand, a room that had been corrected by someone it did not expect, and that contrast stayed with him longer than the numbers ever would. Behind him, Naomi Carter adjusted the final place settings that no longer mattered, her movements calm, precise, unchanged, because for her, this was not a transformation, it was a continuation. She had always seen patterns, always questioned what felt too perfect. The only difference was that today, someone listened. Daniel turned back toward her, not as a CEO addressing staff, but as a man recognizing truth. "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock, he said, simple, direct, not an order, not a request, but an understanding. Naomi met his eyes and gave a small nod, not overwhelmed, not hesitant, just steady, because she understood something just as clearly. Opportunity is not about where you stand. It is about what you see when others do not. And as she walked toward the door, tray in hand, the same way she had walked in, nothing about her appearance had changed, but everything about her position had, not because she demanded it, not because she forced it, but because she revealed something undeniable. And Daniel watched that for a moment, then looked back at the empty table where a $100 million decision had almost been made, and he understood something that could not be written into any contract or model. Power is not in the numbers, it is in the ability to question them. And sometimes, the person who changes everything is the one no one thought to ask, because truth does not need permission, it only needs one moment to be heard. And when it is, everything after that moment belongs to it.